Thank you very much. No one would deny that this technology must be considered a game changer. Not only did it influence the way we access and process knowledge, it had much wider implications because it altered the way society is structured and individuals conceive of themselves, and it colonized the planet in unprecedented ways. You have certainly sensed it. I'm speaking of the arrival of the printing press in the late Middle Ages. Research in the history of printing from Marshall McLuhan and Elizabeth Eisenstein to Michael Giesecke has assessed the media revolution of printing, very roughly speaking, like this. Printing, in many ways, kicked off the Industrial Revolution with its principle of serial production. It established a new notion of textual stability and even of the identity of text. You could and can be quite sure that your copy of a book will be identical to all other copies of the same edition. And it dramatically extended the availability of text and thereby of knowledge. This, again, had multiple further effects. Education could rely less on the presence of an instructor. One could read by and for oneself on a much broader scale. More generally, the potential of writing to make communication independent of time and place could finally be actualized on a societal level. More and more, communication was decoupled from concrete situation and thereby also from the individuals involved. This new way of accessing, distributing, and processing knowledge had consequences for the notion of knowledge itself. The abstraction of the printed word, the fact that it was no longer, or at least less rooted or traceable to concrete situations, implied that representation, for example in illustrations, had to be much more reliable and realistic. This led to the establishment of new standards for objectivity, comparability, and verifiability. On a societal level, the printing press thus advanced the emancipation of science, or rather, the establishment of science as an autonomous, self-determined field within society, independent of other fields. Such other fields were in turn also fostered by the arrival of the printing press. Periodicals established a new form of societal synchronicity. The public, as we know it, is nothing but the imaginary unity of people who read the same press at the same rhythm. This was not only an indispensable presupposition for new forms of politics, such as democracy, but also for new economies that increasingly drew on the synchronized information about market events, etc. The printing press thus contributed to an overall change in the architecture of society, away from an hierarchical and static order that put people into different estates, to an order that differentiated fields of society based on what we call second-order observation. In economy, to buy and sell, one must observe how other people buy and sell. In science, to make an argument, one must look how other people make arguments, and so forth. The resulting self-determined autonomous processes are eventually then more powerful than the individuals involved in them. Of course, these effects of the printed word that I wrapped up rather abstractly were not thoroughly described before the arrival of even newer media in the 20th century. In the late Middle Ages themselves, we mainly see two approaches to the new medium. On the one hand, people sense opportunities. On the other hand, they find themselves asking if this technology is good or bad. I think that this twofold reaction is somewhat congruent to what we see today when confronted with the complex of digitalisation and particularly artificial intelligence. The opportunities seen in these technologies are vast, and there is a chorus of voices disputing if they are good or bad. Official policies tend to somehow balance this twofold reaction in that they generally support digitalization, but always also ask of them to be ethically framed somehow. It seems that the main role of the humanities in this context is often that of an ethical advisor, but I think we claim to be more than just that. One of the major competences of scholarships in the humanities is that we can analyze and interpret the unspoken expectations underlying societal processes. And expectation management is a major issue when dealing with new media. The printing press gave rise to a wide range of new and contradictory expectations. What to expect when people are able to read the scriptures for themselves? Will it let them find a better connection to God, or will it destroy the church? What does the new market for entertainment mean for morals? What will happen to political authority, and so forth? Now, when one's expectations are irritated in such a way, Niklas Luhmann once quipped, there are two possibilities to react. One can change the expectations or stick to them. The first case is called cognition, the second, ethics. This is not to say that an ethical reaction impedes thinking, because actually the ethical reactions to the printing press, particularly those who saw in it a danger to the existing order, were actually quite accurate. But they underestimated the potential of the new medium to also establish a new kind of societal order. In our situation, of course, no one can claim to see clearly where we are heading. But we should at least try to not only ask ourselves if the new technologies are good or bad, or if the utopian or dystopian visions of its consequences are right or wrong, but we should also ask what kinds of expectations are being raised and what we can expect from these expectations. For which reasons and how far are they convincing, and to whom? And what are their societal consequences, if we take into account that societal structures, after all, consist of nothing but expectations in the first place? Just as the ethical reaction to the printing press insisted that certain societal principles should not be touched and that the respective effects of the new technology were to be better controlled, today's ethical reaction to digitalisation, artificial intelligence, and so forth, often aims at damage mitigation. A major problem, for example, concerns the classification of people. We've heard that. Programs trained on masses of data reproduce the biases contained in these data. Other issues are the excessive exploitation of resources, human and non-human, through AI. There is a question of responsibility. We've heard about that, autonomous driving cars and so forth. And then, of course, there is the potential abuse of computer systems by the ones who are running or programming them, which is a problem that I would argue has formerly been called Descartes' demon. Questions such as these are often treated as something to be solved by better algorithms, more just economies, and safer regulation. But there are more general problems and conflicts in the background, because at least partly they result from discrepancies between the self-perception of modern printing-age society on the one hand, and the structures that actually determine this modern society on the other. So the old printed word society, not the coming society, whatever that might be. In his recently published Theory of Digital Society that Georg quoted in his introduction, Amin Nassei claims that there is a far-reaching congruency between the societal structures of Western modernity on the one hand and computational digitalization on the other. Nassei sees a, so to speak, constructivist dimension in both. Computer systems and modern social systems alike operate with data that are decoupled from the environment of the respective system and processed under the conditions of the system only. This is not to say that these data are not pre-structured by the environment, but internally they are taken into account only in the format that the system can process. So computers, of course, work with bits, no matter what they represent to the users, and economy works with payments independently of moral values or political implications. And something like my consciousness, if it exists, works with perceptions and thoughts that only I can somehow access and assess, although I rightly suppose that they are somehow related to my environment. One could formulate, but this is something I add to Nassei's description, that all of us, so the computers, the economy, science, politics, myself, all of us, digitize our environment. We filter out significant units that we can treat according to programs that structure our operations and connect them to one another. Computerized digitalization builds on the already existing modes of digitalization in society. Even statistical pattern recognition in what today is called big data is already inherent in modern society, as the history of probability theory, for example, can easily demonstrate. After all, if modern society is governed by impersonal autonomous processes, it is an obvious strategy to examine the data produced by these processes for hidden patterns that help to make sense of them. So in many ways, thus this way one could also sum up Nasse's hypothesis, computerized digitalization is nothing but the reification of structures and tendencies that were decisive for modern society all along, nothing new. Still, this is only a partial diagnosis because modern society does not perceive itself like this and is generally prone to misinterpretations of its own structure, as it has been widely discussed not only by Luhmann but much more prominently by scholars such as Bruno Latour. Take, for example, what I would like to call the legend of enlightenment. Modernity, according to this legend, is the self-emancipation of reason writ large, and at the same time the self-emancipation of the individual. Philosophers and non-philosophers alike often believe that the area of the Enlightenment was mainly driven by thinking and by thinkers who, in the name of reason writ large, criticized established institutions such as monarchy, the church, and so forth, to make room for new institutions such as democracy, free market economy, science writ large, and so forth. But we know, in fact, that this is not at all true, that the processes behind the Enlightenment were much more complex and that they consisted of various developments that reciprocally triggered one another. I have mentioned only one of the factors here, that is the arrival of the printing press. But the most consequential shortcoming of the legend of enlightenment is the main presupposition connected to the notion of reason writ large, the presupposition that this reason is common to all humans and functions as a means of individual emancipation at the same time. As long as we believe in this one unitary reason, we will underestimate the contribution of the diversity of perspectives that enabled the Enlightenment in the first place. Partly, this diversity has been acknowledged under the name of culture. Culture, when conceived as something like societal imagination, as the bundle of mechanisms that allow us to give significance to the world, allows for mismatches between the resulting webs of significance, as Goetz famously calls them. One can argue that these webs of significance are nothing but different ways to digitize the world, in the sense that I've just outlined. When we discuss culture, we usually imply that there are different ways of establishing significance. Some see significant nuances where others see ornamental noise. And this is the object of cultural comparison. The ever-dynamic webs of culture, those manifold digitalizations of the world, will leave gaps in different places, but they will always leave gaps. The difference between these gaps, the unconnected remainders of communication and of consciousness, so to speak, are the major resource for cultural comparison. Culture is thus a way for modern society to perceive its inherent multiplicity of perspectives. Still, we tend to exclude large parts of society from culture, believing, for example, that science or even economy are above cultural differences. Think of models in the social sciences that distinguish, for example, culturally determined and rational choices of actors. This underestimates, in my opinion, the fact that there's also something like science culture, or in fact many science cultures, as we perceive also in this conference, manifold ways of scientifically digitizing the world that are not necessarily congruent to one another, and that in fact draw their productivity from this incongruency. Just like modern society in general draws its productivity from the incongruencies between science, politics, economy, and so forth. My impression is that the expectations raised and purposely developed by utopian and dystopian thinkers of digitalization and AI alike are doing away with exactly this multitude of perspective constitutive of modernity. And this is what I would like to add to Nassei's diagnosis. Computational digitalization is being imagined in many debates as the reification of reason writ large, as the one reason common to all, reason common to all humans. That is to say that current expectation management with regard to computational digitalization is, at least to some extent, motivated by flawed though popular self-perceptions of modern society. In this combination of reason writ large and computational digitalization of modern metaphysics and new technology challenges the structure of modern society and the role individuals have in this society. Now come to the last part. There is, of course, an intrinsic reason for this. Computational digitalization does indeed process all data alike, ignoring the different social, societal, cultural perspectives that might be inherent to them. It is a force of unification and homogenization. This is what it is best in, where we humans tend to stick to the patterns we know, caught up in our webs of significance, however dynamic they may be. Computer systems find correlations between data sets we thought that were rather unconnected. With regard to the structure of society, the new technologies' capabilities promise, before all, a great simplification. That's a very difficult word. It seems to be much easier to have a system that automatically feeds economic and sociometric data into policy making, for example, to automatically decide on infrastructure project, instead of paying close attention to the complex and manifold procedures foreseen in the different societal fields involved. It's faster, quicker, more immediate. It seems just handy to have a system that assesses the creditworthiness of clients even in correlation to their cultural tastes or anything like that. Why not? And in science, to eventually quit asking about the mechanisms that explain correlations, to quit asking about the mechanisms that explain correlations for the very simple reason that, again, one can very well work with them. This tendency draws a good part of the criticism directed at the AI industry. Science does not want to do away with the principle that finding correlations cannot replace the search for underlying models. And algorithms of automated policy making are criticized ultimately because they illegitimately intermingle fields that we would like to keep separate. Such algorithms evoke unease because they value statistical correlations higher than the intrinsic logic of the different societal fields. There could be a name for it. We feel that these algorithms are ultimately corrupt, because this is how, the interference of these different fields and systems we call corruption. If a painter produces art for political interest, it's corruption. If a politician is paid for his decisions, it's corruption. If a judge decides because for aesthetic reasons, it's corruption. You see, these algorithms, in the great simplification, run the risk of being perceived as inherently corrupt like that. So the expectation is that computational digitalization and AI will do away with separations that we seem to have internalized in the age of the printed word, but at the same time. And it also seems uncanny to replace the many incongruent perspectives inherent to modern society and their respective webs of significance with one computational unitary one. Something similar can be observed on the level of the individual. The trouble here is actually not so much that we see machines performing the job of humans. What is ultimately, though implicitly, perceived to be threatened, in my opinion, is the basis of social connectivity and of communication itself, as we have come to perceive it in modern society. I finally come to the explanation of my title. We know from experience that in any communicative interaction, what I will say is dependent on what, and at the same time, irreducible to what you say. and vice versa. Not only do our utterances mutually influence each other, they are also contingent on both sides. That is, any of your reactions can surprise me at any time and vice versa. We routinely overcome this entanglement by simply communicating. This entanglement is called double contingency. But the solution to simply say something and see what happens brings about some problems, because our ongoing communication, the interaction, will always be beyond our individual control. It is always only established by your next utterance what my utterance will have meant, and vice versa. So, communication establishes significance and meaning recursively, never being determined by and reducible to what individuals say, and even least to what they intend, or what they intend to say. And communicational processes, interactions, even the most simple interactions between two individuals, are thereby, in principle, only always irritated by these individuals. This is what Luhmann means when he claims that communication is decoupled from consciousness. In modern society, this decoupling has been perceived much more acutely than in former societies, and it has usually been described as the emancipation of the individual subject, as a new dimension of freedom. But one might as well argue that modern society builds on the principal exclusion of individuals from society. An exclusion that at the same time makes sure that these very individuals can contribute to more than one or even to all of the major fields of society. So in older society, people were included in their social group, in their estate. You know, if you're a king, you have many freedoms and higher degrees of freedoms than many other people, but you cannot decide not to be king. It's quite impossible. So you're stuck. In the new society, you are not that much fixed in your estate, so insofar you are excluded, but you have the possibility to participate in all kinds of social fields. One of the promises of computational digitalization, one of the expectations raised by those who prefer to look at its opportunities, is that it will do away with this paradoxical situation and with double contingency in general. I've described culture's webs of significance as different digitalizations of the world, and I've highlighted that these digitalizations always leave gaps and create, as a byproduct, a huge amount of momentarily insignificant but still potentially significant material, remainders of societal sense-making. Computational digitalization, in fact, draws on some of these remainders, on parts of this unused and unconnected significance, namely on those parts that are already somehow digitized and processable. So many ignored utterances, so many unread books and emails, so much unclaimed data and metadata. The promise of computational digitalization is that the collection and homogenization of these remainders, their algorithmic exploration, analysis, and evaluation will make consciousness transparent and result in a much better management of societal processes. Of course, this is not new. Leibniz's project of a Characteristica Universalis was in fact already a project for universal digitalization. However, the promise of what has been called dataism is much more concrete, and thereby, in the mode of sheer expectation, of course, much more influential. Computational digitalization will make the behavior and the actions of individuals predictable by combining big data with immense calculation powers and in tracing correlations that human consciousness remains unaware of. The black box of consciousness will turn white, and we will eventually get to know ourselves. Of course, I'm only discussing expectations here. But maybe the notorious ethical reaction to AI can become more nuanced once we realize that some of the reactions to computational digitalization are in fact very much enabled by self-misconceptions of modern society. Independently of that, a truly rational approach to the societal effects of AI would need to assess the gap between what is being and can be digitized by computer systems, on the one hand, and all the remainders, all the gaps in the manifold webs of significance, all the different perspectives. it would be rational to categorically distinguish the individual case from the statistical case as we've always been doing it. Rational in the sense that only thereby one would assess the relation, the ratio, between the systems and networks, however you call it, and their environments. And we are part of that environment. Thank you very much.